Okay, well, hello again, everyone. It's been so long since we've seen you. Minutes it's been. It's been very disturbing. All right, I don't know if you guys know this fella, RJ. We're going to have RJ here, and you may be familiar with him. And new friend, Jackson, who will now tell you about himself. And then they'll, they will discuss Baraminology and Dinesh D'Souza. So, Jackson, tell us a little bit about you, please.
Okay. You guys can hear me all right?
Sound good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I am an undergraduate biology student right now at LSU, Baton Rouge, and I have an absolute passion for evolutionary biology, and so as long as I know, I've always been interested in the subject, and so about 2 years ago, I started writing on it, and I've now finished a manuscript for a book that I would like to get published. Unfortunately, the publishing companies have told me it's too technical for a lay audience, that it wouldn't appeal to them. And so trying to get that work done.
Well, my route, create space.
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah, that's a good idea. But I also started a YouTube channel not even a year ago, I think now, and recently started making videos teaching subjects in biology. And so in my YouTube travels, I came across RJ, and also on Twitter. So I am on Twitter.
Ah, there you go. All right, I will climb up and let you guys discuss.
Yeah, so Jackson, you are also not a fan of Dinesh D'Souza.
Yeah, I can't really say that I like the guy, and I've always, one of the strangest things I ever heard Christopher Hitchens say was it was one of their more fears, considering that he seems so naive with regard to so many subjects.
Yeah, he never sounds like he's naive, though. He came up on my scope, and this is what we kind of started discussing before we had the technical glitch earlier. But because of the Troubles in Paradise project, where I noticed that anti-evolutionists tend to be very politically conservative, I started to measure, well, are all politically conservative people anti-evolutionists or what? So I started to track other ones, which include Ann Coulter and Dinesh D'Souza and Glenn Beck and Savage and a few others that were in the punditry range that you would hear on the radio programs and stuff. This was in the 1990s and so on. And to see whether or not they bumped into anti-evolutionism or not. And a lot of them didn't. Savage is sort of a quasi-evolutionist, and Dinesh D'Souza didn't really focus on that for a long time, and neither did Ann Coulter until she shot her mouth off in Godless in that book, where she basically showed, oh, she can copy intelligent design really easy. Well, D'Souza came in at a relatively superficial level, basically, how dare you evolutionists think you can explain God or our belief in God? And he actually authority quotes stuff back and forth about Daniel Dennett. But where he really my line, where I had my mammalian jaw, he said the Spanish Inquisition really wasn't so bad as everybody thought. Didn't really kill as many people as everyone had claimed, so it wasn't so bad, and that they weren't really targeting Jews, that's just a mythology, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, what? Because I had studied an awful lot about the history of the Inquisition, and so I was curious, on what basis did he conclude this? Well, it turns out he had one and only one source, Henry Kamen's book on a revisionist history of the Inquisition, and it's really good. It's a brilliant, excellent piece of work. I found it at the library, and I recommend Dinesh D'Souza read it sometime because he clearly didn't read its contents very quickly, clearly. The quarter truth of Dinesh's position was that not as many people were killed as everyone thought. And so you had a lot of, this was the same problem that people got into when they were estimating how many heretics were killed in general in Europe, or how many witches got burned. The people kind of made up numbers, particularly in the 1980s and 90s, and there were a lot of political infighting involved. He actually went through and looked at district by district, how many people got attacked by the Inquisition. And he came up, I think, with like 3,000 people over a period of a couple hundred years. And that's not many people at all. At which point I go, you know, if you are a person strapped to a stake and about ready to have your skin burned up in excruciating agony, do you really want some prick like Dinesh D'Souza coming in and going, now don't really complain because not as many of you suffered this as we thought in 20th century historiography? Holy moly! That from your point of view, it's the entire world that's falling apart when you are being persecuted at that level. So that numbers game is a misleading one, but it's worse than that, because Kamen's book meticulously documented that the 3,000 or so death toll wasn't all of who they wanted to kill. They really wanted to murder way more people than that, but they were really inefficient. So they would put like a blanket indictments for thousands of people would be put out in some village where they were going to haul them into the Inquisition. And those people prudently packed up and left. And they moved across the border to Portugal or somewhere else. And so it wasn't for want of trying that they only ended up with 3,000. They were kind of inept and clumsy on this point. That was the quarter truth. But the other one was the targeting Jews issue. And this is pure dissembling evasion, because virtually all of the people who were targeted were the conversos. It was a special term that referred to Jews who had become Christians. Now, technically, the Catholic Church didn't care about you being a Jew, because if you decided to stay a Jew, you were irrelevant. You were never going to get a position of importance. You were never going to be treated equally to anybody else. You could live in your little niche and do your little thing below the radar. But the ones who had converted to Christianity, because that was the only way you could get ahead, they had a suspicion that these new ones who were becoming ministers in the government and doing things, you know, like the same way Jews were doing stuff in Germany and the Weimar Republic and others, that they weren't really Christians after all. You know, should we find out whether they're willing to eat ham? Are they secretly doing Jewy things on the side? That was their obsession. And the only time non-conversos were attacked in the Inquisition in Spain, Kamen documented this in his book, were when they ran out of conversos. And they would go after Protestants up in the northern, the Huguenots that leaked over from France, Protestants up in there. There were some examples of them attacking them, but because they didn't have any conversos to go after. Now, it was even worse than this, because what he failed to notice in reading the book that he supposedly read was how meticulous Kamen was in documenting how weird and creepy the Inquisition was. The first order of business he made quite plain about the system of how it worked. You may not know that it was against church law to kill somebody. That the worst thing that could possibly happen is if you brought a heretic in and tortured them and they died on the rack. Boy, you were in trouble. Wow, that's bad. If you were within death's door, then they would put you over, and they had a paper, and I can't remember the word for it, but it was a specific word of the piece of paper that they signed that said, now you are the property of the state. The church is not, it's not our responsibility anymore. We're not going to own it like Trump on Trump Care. It's now the physical royal government that's responsible. And so technically speaking, when somebody was burned at the stake, it was done by the state, never the church, even though there were priests there and there was a whole bunch of blessings that went on and it was very religious. But no, it's not the church doing it. It's the monarchy, the state, that's actually killing them. So there was a little paper they signed, and that was their conscience cleared. The other aspect that was really weird about it had to do with the fact you had to be burned, not head chopped off, not pummeled with stones, not lectured to death with Dinesh D'Souza's speeches, although that could probably kill you and would be a form of torture. No, definitely. You had to be burned. And the weird example, there was an example in Kamen's book, which therefore theoretically Dinesh should know about, where one guy was hauled in and charged with heresy, and so was his mother, retroactively, because she had inconsiderately died in the meantime. And so they convicted her retroactively of heresy as a false converso. And because of the rules, They dug her body up so they could burn her remains, which is the rule of how you're supposed to do all of this stuff. Now, is this weird or creepy or what?
That is a bit on the strange side, yes.
Mm-hmm. And here,
I mean,
that was in the
stranger than my Saturday night.
Yeah, indeed. That the issue that Dinesh can't seem to wrap his ideological brain around is the idea that it is wrong in principle to burn people at the stake or kill them at all just for differences of belief. That no institution, I'm an absolute moralist, no institution in any society, in any species, in any universe whatsoever can ever consider that right. Any deity, alleged or otherwise, that condones such behavior is intrinsically immoral. Now, is that absolute enough for you? And Dinesh can't seem to wrap his brain around that. He can kind of go playing numbers game. You get the same problem with the French Revolution. There are ones who argue that the French Revolution wasn't really so bad because only a few thousand people were guillotined. And technically speaking, more people, I think 50,000 people were killed when the communards were suppressed by the new French Republic after the war in 1870, when they got defeated by the Germans. And numbers games like this are really bad, because individually, you're the only number that matters. And the fact that there are 1,000 of you being killed, or 10,000 or 1,000,000, it compounds the issue socially, but it doesn't change the fact that your life is suddenly shit. And so we get into the same problem when you deal with the pecking order of violence. The biggest mass murderer by sheer numbers apparently is Mao Zedong, because he had a lot of people to oppress, basically working people to death. Stalin comes in number 2 at about 30 to 35 million. Also basically working people to death. He's typically, they don't have any gas chambers, none of that. Poor little Hitler. Yeah, and exactly, the gulags. A poor little Hitler comes in a poor third here with 12 million people. But does anybody that has a functioning brainstem think that if Hitler had won the Second World War, that death toll would have climbed up? He would have exterminated everybody in Africa, everybody in North and South America that wasn't Aryan. He would have gotten rid of Asians. The whole plot of Man in the High Castle, which I would love to see but don't have access to Netflix, was the idea that in the alternate universe where the Axis won the Second World War, the Japanese and Germans are kind of coming at loggerheads, because ideologically the Nazis would have liked to get rid of the Japanese too, and Asians as inferior peoples. And so they were thinking of using atomic weapons against the Japanese, and that's one of the plot lines that goes on in Man in the High Castle that was written back in the 60s by the incredibly brilliant and weird Philip K. Dick. So there are so many theodicy issues involved with the general principle is, should people ever be persecuted for belief, not action? And the Spanish Inquisition and Torquemada and the Italian Inquisition and heretic hunting in general and Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler and all of those all come up in what goes on in North Korea today. They're all methodologically indistinguishable. They have different levels of death count, but they're still creepy, and they're vicious, and they're anti-human. They are not secular. They call themselves atheists or not. Whatever it is they believe is vicious. And all reasonable people who believe, as Spinoza does, that the sanctity of the human thought is the most precious thing ever, and you never suppress that, that is the thing that separates all of the kill people for belief from the people who don't. I will pause for breath, and you can come in and have a comment, Jackson.
See, I never even heard that he made that claim. The claim that I always heard him make was, it seemed he would acknowledge that the Inquisition was bad, but he would say, "Oh, boo-hoo, a few people died in the Inquisition. Look at the Hitler," and he would include Hitler, which frankly, I think historians are unsure. I'm not going to say whether he was one way or the other. I've read
Hitler was a Hitlerist. He was a Latin Catholic, and he troped Christianity. He didn't like standard Christianity at all. He thought they were too weak-kneed. If you were an anti-Semitic Christian, he was okay with you. And there were plenty of anti-Semitic Christians to knock around.
There was there's an old, was it Seneca who said religion is viewed by the was it by the weak-minded is true, the wise is false, and the rulers is useful?
Yeah,
Wasn't that
that's
it?
partly it. That there were various range. Of course, when you move over into atheism land in the Soviet Union and the PRC and all of that, now they're officially doctrinal atheists. Although in practice, it functions like a theocracy with all of the same things. Stalin becomes like a father figure, godlike. You have the saints of the things. It functions dynamically indistinguishably. There's some wonderful work that's been on the history of the Soviet Union and all the dynamics of all of that. And the religion never went away. Now you find that lockstep between the Russian Orthodox Church and Putin re-emerging after the Soviet era, where they are now linking up again. And I think there's going to be some times when some people in Trumplandia are going to find that their brand of Protestantism isn't getting favored in Putlandia because they regard them as heretics, really. But anyway, down to Hitler and all of the numbers games matters. That about whether or not you should be persecuting people at all. And the boo-hoo numbers game stuff, when you look at it methodologically, you can see the moment the state has the power to enforce ideological orthodoxy to the level of killing you or threatening to kill you, that's the defining characteristic. And that's exactly what genuine secularists and believers in reason and freedom don't accept, that no state should ever be allowed to do that. And the fact that the Spanish Inquisition were rank amateurs, for one thing, all of the great, air quotes, great mass murderers had the advantage of the 20th century. They had railroads, they had telegraphs, they had ways of transporting people on a volume, they had passports, they had identification papers that they could filter you out, that could prevent you from doing stuff because they could keep track of you way easier than the Inquisition did in the 1600s. And that kind of revisionism is just twaddle, that it misses the whole fundamental point. Should the Catholic Church ever have had the right to burn even one person at the stake? And I say, nope. There it is.
I agree. Totally agree.
Now, if we can move on. I'll add one thing about Dinesh D'Souza, because I put a couple things up on my YouTube channel about the fact his bad method, that when it comes to climate change, he is demonstrating his superficiality yet again, because he relies on just secondary sources to announce that stuff is true, and he never bothered to fact check any of it. So I got all the sources up on that. So now you want to talk about baraminology?
Yeah, that's a subject that always gets me going. I could just rant about that subject all day, let me tell you. Sometimes I do, for myself.
Rant.
You said you want to hear me rant?
Yeah, a short introductory rant as to what it is about baraminology that ticks you off and the basic whys of it, and see whether or not it matches up with why I regard it as such a thing to rant about.
All right, we'll see. All right, so for me, the major problem is, to all of you who don't know me, I work at, or I intern, I should say. We'll see if I get paid for what I do this coming semester, at the LSU Museum of Zoology down in Baton Rouge. And so I work with mammalogists and geneticists and ichthyologists and ornithologists who study the genetics, who study the relationships among organisms. In the Department of Mammalogy, I got to see work on murids, on old world murids mostly. They were trying to find out if there were how many radiations of murids there were in the old world.
Murids being just
mice and rats.
Okay. Oh, good. Yes. Yeah. And in fact, that's a huge chunk of mammals are just rats and bats.
Yeah. So they were trying to figure out how many different radiations of murids there were in Asia, I think, or in Eurasia, if I remember correctly. So, anyways, so I got to see their work firsthand, and when creationists and intelligent design advocates describe the relationships among organisms, they categorically fail to understand that you can see the relationships, the genetic relationships, or morphological, or behavioral, or the relationships in the fossil record, or whatever. They categorically fail to understand them because they think they can just box everything up. okay, cats are over here, dogs are over here, elephants are over here, etc., and there are no overlappings anywhere. And so what's ridiculous about it is you can show that they're related to each other. The creationist or intelligent design cry that, oh, the atheist evolutionists are just forcing this evolutionary relationship on organisms, that cry shouldn't exist. Because if baraminology were true, we should be able to find a point where it's just dogs or just cats or just elephants. We shouldn't be able to find things like Dormala or the Miacids from the Eocene and infer this relationship among organisms, among these two groups specifically. And so we shouldn't be able to, quote, force relationships on these organisms. It shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be able to if they were all specially created. That's my problem.
Okay. The fun part about baraminology is that it came in kind of a long-term thing, and it's fascinating how recent it is. The term itself was coined by a creationist March, and remember, he was a young Earth creationist back in the 30s, 40s. And he thought, okay, we are going to be sciencey. We need to do science on our side, and you got to give him props for that. So he's going to work out how many kinds there are. And even based on the number of species and the relationships they knew back then, remember, this was before DNA analysis, before they knew about homeobox genes, blah, blah, blah. He was really discovering there was way too much data to account for, and he bogged down and never quite finished it. So along comes the new breed, the Young Turks, your Todd Woods and Kavanaugh and Kurt Wise and all that, who are, Kurt Wise in particular is trained in paleontology. He has a degree in it from a real live college. He studied under Stephen Jay Gould. He knows all the terminology and so forth. They got together in the late 1990s and decided they're going to do serious baraminology. And so he is the one that, Kurt Wise is the one that put in all the terminology of monobaramins and holobaramins and aplobaramins, all of which are things that are cribbed from cladistic analysis. That is the new systematic tool that was developed by Billy Hennig back in the 1960s and has become the ubiquitous tool that's used in all systematics today, because it works, because it's not based on evolutionary assumptions. It's just an analytical tool to be able to test out the plausibility of relationships based on parsimony. That's a short definition of that thing. Anyway, so the concept is they're using the data that they're cribbing from the cladistic taxonomy, but they're filtering it into a completely different context. Have you read the John Woodmarap's thing on the reptile-mammal transition at all?
The only paper on the reptile-mammal transition that I've read was the first one we discussed.
Oh, Aaron?
What?
Woodmarap, yeah, that's the one from AIG. I go through all of that in Slam Dunk, but there's actually another one, that a guy named M. Aaron, and I can literally not find out what the M stands for. He's that shy. That did at Answers in Genesis more recently, I think 2010 or so, where he tried to do the Cassiids, the one and only family, because there was a different way. He was actually trying to do a baraminology analysis. Woodmarap isn't really doing a baraminology. He's doing an anti-cladism. But the thing is that what they've got are all these raw numbers. If anybody is familiar with systematics, if you look at a cladistic analysis paper, you'll go down and there's these hundreds of character states, and there are numbers that represent the various features of the character state. So you might have 0 representing the ancestral state, and then 1 involves the change. So it might be the absence of a bone bump at the 0, and then that little bone forms and it's a 1, and maybe if it gets even bigger and shaped slightly differently, it'll be classified as a 2, you know. And so you got all these different number states. Sometimes it'll be the 1 that is the character state that starts out, and 0 is the absence of that trait as a derived characteristic, and you may or may not have a 2 or 3 or something else. It varies. The problem Woodmarap is doing right off the bat is he's thinking that you can do these as if they're numbers. But the character states aren't numbers, they're character states. You could call them A, B, C, and D. You could call them cucumber, elephant, knockmarg, knackabluk. You wouldn't necessarily need to use numbers to denote them. So the idea that he can just go in and add up the numbers and come up with these analyses when they're not numbers was a mistake right off the bat. Plus, he didn't even follow his own rules, and he screwed up the details and all that, and I went into all that. Now, your true baraminologists, Aaron and Kavanaugh and all the rest, when they do their baraminology studies, they're doing something else. They're taking all this raw numbers and putting it into essentially a multi-dimensional matrix. And the theory is that if you plot everything out graphically, you're going to see this blob that's a kind, and then another blob that's a kind, and there ain't going to be any overlap. If there are overlaps, then that means theoretically they're all the same kind, or rather that they're all the same Baramian, or hollow Baramian, which is a fossil representation. And that means the subgroups, the sub-blobs that are connected together are monobaramians that are natural branching evolutionary relationships within a kind. So that monobaramian is the one that jumped right out at me, because that's conceding an evolutionary relationship. Now, one of the monobaramians they come up with is the horse sequence. All of it. From Heracitherium all the way through to Equus is a monobaramian, according to Wood and Kavanaugh's own study that came out in like 2006. And this is like one of those where, excuse me, it's like you're saying the Pope is actually a Martian. I mean, it's such a gigantic concession that you would wonder that other people don't go overboard on it. But the fact is, most creationists don't bother reading the Baraminologist, and they don't seem to realize the significance of it. Now, here's where it gets fun, because when you look at their analysis, they have to do data selection to trim things down. So yeah, they've dealt with the horse sequence. Well, you've got Heracitherium, which is about the size of a collie dog and is like anatomically, it's the same bones that you would find with a horse. It would have all 5 digits. It doesn't have the specialization there. Some of the specialization with horse teeth haven't emerged yet. That's way down the road. Look at another little critter called Homo galax. Homo galax lived around the same time, and it's almost identical to Heracitherium, but it's got a few tiny little tweaks, difference in the anatomy. And it's the group that leads off to tapirs. Now, if you can keep Heracitherium and Dinohippus and Mesohippus and Equus as part of a monobaramian, that much variation where teeth are changing, toes are dropping off, how can you possibly keep Heracitherium from connecting up with Homo galax? And therefore, by the same logic, Homo galax and tapirs are the same monobaramian as horses. And if you start looking at phenacodonts, the ancestral group from which Heracitherium and Homo galax come, how can you distinguish them baraminologically? Well, the answer is they don't look. They just lop off and don't think about it. In Aaron's case on the Cassiids, the one and only family, are you familiar with the Cassiids from the reptile-mammal transition?
Yeah, primitive Pelycosaurus.
Yeah, they're and they got really tiny heads. You got this great big pudgy body that's about the size of a Dimetrodon, I think, and yet it's got this teeny tiny little head on his short neck, and it looks very, very peculiar. And they're wondering about how its diet worked and a bunch of other things. There's not many species in it, and so of all of the synapsids he picks, Aaron decides to go after one that has a very sparse fossil record, that has very distinctive anatomy, and is a sideline cousin group over in the corner somewhere. That's the one he decides to go after. Even at that, he lopped off a third of the data. He would decide if there was any uncertainties in, if you had a fossil that was partial, he would decide you could jump all of that data out. Then he also failed to consider the ancestral groups that are close cousins to the Cassiids. And he stepped right over the characteristics that would link you up with the precursor group as well. So it's just a hilarious example of him trimming the data set down. Then the other one so there you've got all these reptile mammal transition families. I would love to see any baraminologist hair split their way through the reptile mammal transition, taxa by taxa by taxa by taxa by taxa, and find places where they can isolate distinctive baramians in that, when they can't even pull it off with the damn Cassiids. And there haven't been any studies yet that I've seen on this. Then we get to the hilarious one that I sent you the link on that paper, where I think it was Wood, who, when he did his little baraminology blobs, had Australopithecus sediba in the same human holobaramian as human beings. He couldn't get Homo habilis in there, I think, or any of the other Australopithecines, but he managed to put sediba in, and you go, whoa, a baraminology is useless. It is meaningless. It is gibberish, because it leads to preposterous, even from their own positions. Now, the The big issue with baraminology is the fact they're forced into this by the dynamic of flood geology and the mandate about human specialness. Human beings must, yeah, well, human beings must be a special created kind, no exceptions. Whereas if you decide species is kind, you have so many damn critters on the ark, there ain't room. So the traditional definition of kind is a family, and most of the baraminologists use family level as representing a baramin. And you can come up with, I guess, that from what I'm looking at, that 8,000 baramin number that Kent Hovind tosses around is probably reflecting the family level. Sometimes, though, they go higher because some of these things are distinctive phyla. If you try to deal with some of the weird little critters, I don't know how anxious they are to include chinorynchs and stuff into the mix. But anyway, the problem is that in order to keep the number of kinds on the ark down to a level where they can manage it, they've got to have super duper speciation post-flood, and yet they also have to have one species, ours, as the exception to the rule, where it's not the primate family that's the kind. That includes Bonzo the chimp. I'm terribly sorry. That's a pretty broad group. So they can't ever allow the family to apply to us as a kind, although Subdiba gets knocked in. But they have to have the family apply, and then they tend to lop off the paleontology, and therefore they don't deal with how many fossil kinds there are, and therefore they don't deal with how many fossil kinds went extinct. All of the dinosaur kinds apparently went extinct, unless you count the stegosaurs wandering around Cambodia, according to a misinterpreted picture in the Khmer period in the 12th century. And or the supposed brontosaurs that are tromping around in Africa in a spot that no one ever manages to take a selfie with.
So you got Mabutu Mbembe or something like that?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. They're forced by the logic of their kindology to have remnant animals. Because remember, the whole purpose of the ark was preserving all the kinds on the ark. And for there to be so many ones going extinct afterwards, that's why it's very tough for them to really come clean on listing off all the kinds that are on the ark and then putting little asterisks next to the names of all the ones that went extinct. Oh, because that's going to mean that it was a terrible ark.
Well, that's actually something I wanted to. First, I want to say two things. First, I totally agree on the, and I think it's hilarious that they can't stick. That none of them seem to know what kind means. Not one of them can figure it out and be consistent with others. I've heard Georgia Purdom use different definitions from, Mo Kelly, somebody in the comments said that's right. And so
yeah, I can't see the comments, unfortunately, so I'm kind of disconnected from that. Sai, can you manage to put the thing up so that's showing default rather than my mug or Jackson's? Because I'd like to see the comments on there. That probably that's totally off screen on my thing. I'm seeing Jackson at the moment, and then when I'm talking, I'm seeing me, which doesn't help at all. I don't want to see me.
The Sai Strikes or camera, and I can see it on mine.
Yep, click on me. It'll bring the screen up for you.
Oh, okay. There we go. I see it now. Yeah,
you good?
Bingo.
Okay.
So
yeah, you just keep it up. Keep it up. Thank you.
All right. Carry on.
Yeah, make it so that doesn't pop up.
So Ken Ham actually used two different definitions of kind in his debate with Bill Nye. He said the families Canidae and Felidae, but he said the order Proboscidea for elephants.
Yeah,
and
bingo.
So, yeah, and then Georgia Purdom said
consistency is not Ken's long suit.
Yeah.
If I had been there, the moment I would have seen that ceratopsid picture that he put up, which was one of the illustrations from his museum, I would have pounced. I would have gone, oh gosh, Ken, ceratopsids. Now, are psittacosaurids and protoceratopsids the same monobaramin as that or not? And just wait to see his eyes glaze over.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could. I think that would be pretty funny, but I also don't want to give money to them just to go to their museum.
Oh, no, but this was in the context of the debate.
Okay.
That Bill Nye been up on the issue of baraminology, because of the Creation Museum, and so too the ARC thing, is pushing baraminology. But I don't think Ken Ham's ever read any of the baraminology stuff, and certainly not at any technical level, because this guy is a secondary redactor. He's still claiming the horse sequence doesn't exist, when clearly Wood and company have conceded that it is a monobaramin.
But yeah, in an interview Georgia Purdom did for one of their, I get a show maybe they do. It's just her. Yeah. It's like she's just being interviewed where she says bird kind and dinosaur kind. I actually have the clip on one of my videos. I think it's a response to evolution.
Read her own stuff too, because Sarah Leitner at AIG did a whole analysis where Leitner determined from their point of view there are like 100 and either 86 or 96 bird kinds. So the idea that there is a bird kind is inconsistent with Leitner's analysis. So we now know that Purdom apparently doesn't bother to read Leitner or bother to have any consistency. No, this is absolutely inevitable. Now, the funny part comes when you go over to Intelligent Design Land, because they do not have a need to explain the ARC. They are not trying to book the ARC, so they don't have to worry about how many kinds there were versus species. So suddenly they drop off the map and literally never think about whether there are kinds, or when you look at Michael Denton and his stupid types, we don't know how many types there are because they don't think about it. At least the creationists try to figure a little bit of it out, but they immediately trip up over themselves. They can't avoid it, because a true systematics is going to reflect the true nature of life. And I'm sorry, but everything is related by natural branching common descent. So kindology, baraminology, typology is never going to explain even a chunk of the data, let alone the whole data stream. They're going to bog down the moment they try to look at the details, and they do bog down, as you've noticed and I've noticed.
Yeah, I mean, the whole contend with the whole problem of a twin-nested hierarchy. They can't get away from that, because as soon as you start looking at all the characteristics we have, but notice that many other animals and organisms in general also have these characteristics. Like Arnaud's doing this new series. He's talking about the cladistics of life. He's going through. He said we are uniconts because our sex cells have a single flagella, and we're opiscecont or opisthecont because the flagella pushes from the rear rather than pulls from the front. So yeah, why do we share that odd? Why do we share that odd?
No, go ahead.
With fungi, with choanoflagellates, with sponges and elephants? Why do we share that odd little trait with all these other organisms?
Yeah, and so this whole notion of exaptation, which is a Stephen Jay Gould term, co-opting, pops up relentlessly, of things that we still have as a basal system in our biology that then takes on novel functions in addition to doing what it did before. So just even when we're getting down to the primate family, the system that we use as a way of self-deception in our brains is the brain system that primates have used for all their times to work out social relationships within their social networks. We've co-opted that as a self-deception system, and it's in the prefrontal cingulate cortex, I think it's called. And that's another area where all of the neurobiology and the behavioral research that works out what brain systems that we use to do all the things that we do for moral reasoning and a whole bunch of stuff, literally that subject doesn't show up in anti-evolutionism, whether it's intelligent design or young earth creationism. They just don't notice it. So the whole anti-evolution biz is a matter of what information are they not going to pay attention to, and then do they even try to explain the limited data set they do try, and they don't even manage that. Baraminology is just a textbook example of that.
Yeah, it is just an absolute failure, and yet all these different like hardcore creationist groups come to LSU, and then they, they're slipping in things like kind in like what they're saying when you talk to them, And so I always have fun with these guys, asking them, "Can you define what this word means? Can you give me a specific example?"
Or can you give from a methods point of view, I would be even more specific, because the kind, asking them to define it, they could give the kind of thing that Kurt Wise would give, which is kind of boilerplate, a mutually reproducing system. No, you want to ask how many kinds there are. That's the question they're going to snag on, because there's literally nowhere they could have gone to answer that question. Or if you want to ask them how many synapsid kinds are there, you'll know from reading my book, nobody has figured that out, period. So there would be no place they could go. And to force them to say, gee whiz, well, somebody must have done that. Oh, you want to bet? That puts them on the defensive in terms of their own data stream.
Yeah, or as Kent Hovind said, "Oh, we'll just have to keep putting scientific effort into it." Well, we haven't put any effort to begin with into it, so how can we put more into it?
Baraminologists are a textbook example. First of all, there are only a handful of people involved. I mean, you've got Kurt Wise, Kavanaugh, Todd Wood, Aaron, and you could toss in a couple others along the side. There's another guy I think has done a thing on yipes. There's some invertebrates and stuff that he's gone into, and some on some plant stuff. There's, I think, so let's say about 5 or 6 people who are actually doing baraminology.
Okay.
Holy moly, that's pathetic. And then you can literally look at their works. Not all of it is immediately accessible, but they're open enough on it. Most of it's popping up lately in the Answers in Genesis research journal. Aaron's stuff popped up in that level. And so everybody can, theoretically, they can download the material, they can look at the data sets involved. What I did with Aaron's is that he cited technical papers, and I could get the technical papers so I could see his data stream. And at that moment, I can pick out exactly what he's stepping around and what he isn't. And I did a little bit earlier. It's not in the tip publication stuff. It was just stuff I did in the research end of it on Wood and Kavanaugh bunch when they were going in about sunflowers. And that's a really small group in effect. There's a lot of different sunflower species, but they're still operating really at the genus level on that one. And they're concluding that it's a monobaramin, and they work out what they think is an explanatory model. But
like all of Helianthus is a monobaramin, and plus other species of some.
The internal variation within that is pushing the load limit of a kind, because if you start applying that in other areas, you're going to really show that things that they would treat as a separate kind. Is there really more difference between a cat and a dog than in some of the variations that you're seeing in the way that the photosynthesis system functions in that group? No, there's at the technical level, there's a vast amount of information. And so the inherent flaw of all anti-evolutionism is that somehow if you start looking at the natural theology nuts and bolts level, that this is going to somehow help their case. And instead it doesn't. Your Behe types will insist, oh, the cell is complicated. And that turns out to be the gee whiz argument, where they just go in all the time where they'll say, look at how complicated this is. Wow. Hugh Ross is prone to do that. I've been acting as a prod, a sweet, good old Hugh Ross. He actually replies to my tweets once in a while. And he would come up with these gee whiz things where he'll cite some technical paper and talk about how amazing the design is of this thing. And I'll go, oh, and there's an evolutionary history behind it. And I'll cite a bunch of papers that refer to this. And he then suddenly starts talking about that stuff. He very seldom ever responds to it. And he's been doing less and less and less of that since I started doing that. So I'm wondering whether I'm giving us a selection pressure, whether in his back of his head, this is my ego talking. I'm going all Trump on you. But I'm wondering whether or not he's doing that less and less because he's worried that damn RJ guy is going to dump on him with some damn technical paper if he dares mention it. I don't know.
I feel that I feel that there would be a lot more push on the or against the baraminologists if what they talked about were more understandable to a lay audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to basically understand cladistic taxonomy, and you need to know all the terminology. It's going to seem complicated to your Joe Cisnitskys and Tammys and preachers and various ones that flirt around on Twitter. These people are 800 miles away from the technical terminology, so they're completely at sea, but they don't even bother citing the baraminologist. I haven't encountered a Twitter person yet that seems to have read any of it.
That's true, yeah. And I mean, as you pointed out before, they don't even read their own papers. So, you know,
I'm literally measuring it in the TIT project. 95% of the 2,000 people I track do not cite primary source science literature at all. And so they, by definition, are secondary redactors. And the 5% who do, the technical ones, are only bumping into about 10% of the science data stream. And remember, there's only, I think I've updated my list, I think now up to a whopping, 50 fact claimants in the biz. Wow, 50 people. That's all. That's their entire fact claimant core. It's pathetic.
It is, definitely. I mean, it's, you know, it must be hard for them to cite technical literature when none of it agrees with them.
Oh, but you're not a Tortugan. If you look at this, this is why it's fascinating. You're basically, when you do a source methods analysis, and by the time you've read through Evolution Slam Dunk, you're going to see exactly how I do it, because it's right in front of you. It's looking at what the content of the material is, constantly trying to figure out what the hell do they think happened? Do they explain what they think happened? No, they don't. And then, but what about this? Wouldn't this have to happen? And then you look in the material and you find out that it actually does that kind of thing. When you're looking under the hood of their evasion mechanisms, their rationalization mechanisms. And it's such a consistent pattern all the way up and down the food chain. Michael Denton, I think, is probably the most useful example here, because he is not religious. He's an agnostic, according to his own identification. He's pushing typology, which is kind of kissing cousins to Keynes and baraminology. And he is citing quite a lot of technical literature because he has that element. And I went through, look up every damn paper that he cited in his new book. But when you see how he's actually approaching that data, oh boy, it's sad. He can't get past the abstract level. He's operating at such a superficial level where again and again and again, relevant information is literally under his nose, and not once does he ever follow through up on it. That's telling you about how his brain works, how his tunnel vision mind is just looking for snippets that fit what he wants to be true, and he pulls that out, and that's as far as he goes. There's no curiosity, no follow through.
Yeah, you don't hear, on that same thing, you don't hear, or at least I've never heard anything about the post-flood great speciation events, because evidently, according to them, if the flood is true and these extreme population bottlenecks, which never happened, then we should expect in their mutation rates to see some hyper-caffeinated speciation events going on, which is very evidently not grounded in reality, and yet I don't see any of them talking about it.
You would find haplotype bottleneck in every single kind that exists on Earth, because every single one of them filtered through either 2 or 7 elements. And even though this is implicit in young Earth creationism, you can't find diddly squat on this stuff. That even when they're bringing up some side issues, this is inadvertently popping up with Jeffrey Tompkins and the chromosome fusion issue. That's just relating to our narrow kind. Would he argue that there was or wasn't a seemingly fused chromosome in Australopithecus sediba? And by the way, since everything is only 4,500 years old from the flood, how come we don't have the DNA from them like we have from Neanderthals and us?
Very true. Heck, we should have it from all fossils.
Oh, exactly. You should be able to radiocarbon date dinosaurs. Now, some creationists claim you can, but yet there are always examples of where they basically got bad contamination. And the point is not only that. Well, another one, there was just a creationist that I bumped into at one of these sites, and he was insisting Oh no, actually, it was on a website thing that I was responding to somebody at the Great Debate Community, and he was insisting that 90% of all all dinosaurs aren't even fossilized; they're soft tissue. And I'm going, what? I'd like to see some sources on that little puppy. And what he clearly had confused was this issue about soft tissue preservation, which of course is incredibly microscopic. It's trapped inside of bones, and it's all relating to the Schweitzer work and all that cluster. That he actually thinks that the vast majority of fossils from dinosaurs aren't fossils. They're actually these soft tissue preservations, I guess, with skin attached and all of that. And he can't even have got that by reading creationist literature, because they don't claim that. But there's a vagueness when you look at the various accounts of the Schweitzer work over the years and the new stuff from Armitage with the Triceratops stuff, that they are very vague about telling you how big the sample was and how this is, you know, viewed with microns, and that it's all very, very tiny stuff that they have to open up bones to be able to find. That's buried down in their fine print. So people who are not prone to reading fine print only have to be just as vague as Michael Denton is in intelligent design land to make those mistakes, and they do. Same method.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're not reading the source material. They're reading articles that are making this way out to be. They're reading like a sensational. There we go, sensationalized articles from, you know, Huffington Post or what have you.
They're secondary source addict. Secondary source addiction is the crack addict of young earth creationism, and for that matter, Jeranism and everybody else. You've got people that tell you something you want to be true. You decide that's true. It's a secondary source. You never bother to check any of the primary sources, and you repeat that claim as if it were a primary source. That's exactly what Dinesh D'Souza was doing with climate change, or for that matter, the claim that there was a lot of voter fraud and stuff. He would link to a secondary source, and that says what he wants to be true. It must be true. Well, heck almighty, Dinesh, if you can do that, why can't Jeranism do that? Why can't Ken Ham do that? Why can't Malcolm Bowden, the geocentrist creationist, do that? Doesn't everybody get to play? And while we're at it, why can't we bring Eric Von Daniken and that little troll that does the stuff on the History Channel for him? Don't they get to play too? They want to play. And in a world where alternative facts are the norm, they're going to play.
Yeah, I watched Is Genesis History the other day, and I tweeted about it as I watched it. And of course, they had a part where the guy who does it, I can't remember his name, but is this older guy, and he's interviewing.
Yeah, I forgot his name. Basically, an interviewer type. I was always more interested in the people he was interviewing than his name, and I can't remember his name too. I got it listed in my bibliography.
Anyways, so he talks to a guy who I think self-identifies as a paleontologist, and says, "Oh, we found this elastin or whatever it is, the protein that they found in the Tyrannosaur fossils that Schweitzer's team came up with or discovered." And what they never mention, the word fossilization does not come up when they're discussing the elastin. He makes it, the article, or the way he's painting it, the interview, makes it sound as though this is like elastin from an animal that died recently.
Yeah, they're not talking about what the details are. Another thing that pisses me off on that is how they use the word we. And Snelling and others use that as well. We have discovered this information. No, you didn't discover it. Regular scientists did the work in almost all cases. The one area where you actually would have a we would be Armitage's stuff on the Triceratops. It was published in an obscure but legitimate science journal. And of course, it's a whole side issue that we can get into at some other day. But this whole fossil preservation issue, paleontologists have known for an enormous time that there's a whole spectrum of preservation elements. Sometimes you can actually have things where the actual physical bone has been replaced. In other cases, it isn't. And it depends on how old it is, and it depends on the taphonomy of what kind of biological characteristics that go on. Sometimes it can relate to ocean chemistry and different factors. That's the thing that screams about the Cambrian explosion, that there's an ocean chemistry issue, that you've got these 3 dam Lagerstätten, all equatorial deposits that produce these fabulous preservation rates on stuff that you don't find anywhere else on the planet. in the Cambrian, and therefore you don't know what's going on because something about the ocean chemistry in that is unique. It's specialized. It's not what we're used to in modern circumstances. And trying to retro-calculate that from modern ocean chemistry and fossilization processes 500 million years later, it ain't easy. And guess who isn't doing the work on that? The creationists.
Yeah. The other, well, see that's another thing I wanted to point out. The Cambrian, because I know that generally creationists they ignore or they deny the existence of the fossil record, saying that, oh, you're just inferring that these things were older than the other based on your, evolutionary assumptions. But in the video, is Genesis history, they actually accept all of the geologic time, all of the Paleozoic geologic time periods. I think Apologia and Sci-Strike did the reviews of it, and so actually, did you go through it?
I've seen some of them. I've not seen that particular one. Creationists are perfectly happy with air quotes accepting the geological material because in the Cambrian case, though, young Earth creationists are essentially saying this stuff is occurring during the flood. So there's no 520 million years ago for them on this one, but they're still focusing in, as intelligent designers do, on the supposed simultaneousness and the supposed abruptness of it, which is abrupt if you parse the data set. I've always wanted to, let me just pause for just literally a few seconds. I got to go in and grab a Pepsi because I need to have something to cool my thing off. I'll be back in just a flash.
In the meantime, I will distract you with my juggling skills. Oh wait,
there, I'm back.
So I have a question. Quick. Was it you or Apologia who did the episode on the geologic time periods where they're going through the museum and they see the whale fossil and stuff?
That's
and the
Paul's.
Triceratops? Was that you or Apologia?
That was Apologia's.
Was it? Okay.
We alternated.
If you can get a link to that, tweet it to me on a private chat or something, and I'd like to go to see that. Anything relating to how creationists deal with chronology issues and that stratigraphy issue is just right up my alley, because that's an area where you can see that somebody is playing fast and loose with the data stream. What I've always wanted to do with a creationist, and I've never been in a debate with them to where I can pull the trump card here, is to ask them, oh gosh, you're bringing up the Cambrian. Let's talk about the Cambrian. And so you ask to say, how many in the audience know what the hell we're talking about? And I imagine a lot of them won't raise their hand. So then you lay the trap. You go, oh, let's explain what this is. So you turn to your creationist colleague and say, oh, imagine we're on a beach in the Cambrian. Rivers coming down from some mountain, and there's maybe a volcano spurting out in the bay and whatever. Describe for us all the life that we're seeing. And then hand it to them to show their stuff. Because, boy, I bet a lot of them haven't a clue what they would be seeing, even though the answer is really, really easy to do. You know what the answer is?
For land or in water?
Yeah, what you would be seeing on the beach.
Oh, you wouldn't see anything. You'd be dead.
It's like Antarctica on a bad day. We suspect, the scientists, I'd expect to find bacteria if you could start analyzing a lot of the rocks. Although it's hundreds of millions of years before plants and insects and others kind of start following the thing, partly because the oxygen levels are just starting to rise during this period. And so the ozone level needed to reduce the ultraviolet radiation is taking a while. The other one that I would want to bring in is the issue of how many things are around in there. And so the issue of how many phyla there are. Do they know how many phyla there are? Do they know how many of the phyla have a fossil record that you can trace back to the Cambrian?
Do they know what a phyla is? Or a phylum is?
See, there's about 35 animal phyla, and indeed the about is complex because sometimes, particularly the latest cladistic, lumps some phylas together that were normally separate, because the new analysis suggests that they're actually part of the same thing. Others have been split up and depends on how they divide them and all that. But 35-ish is about right. But half of them have no fossil record at all, let alone going back to the Precambrian or Cambrian. And so then some of the phyla, notably chelicerates and chordates, are ones where you're seeing the evolutionary ancestors in the Cambrian. That there's no coincidence the paleontologists were not ripping their garments in despair and gnashing their teeth over the Cambrian chordates, because they were what you were expecting Cambrian chordates to look like. They look like lamprey larvae. The little wiggly little things. They're not fish. They're only about an inch long. And you then have to ask, if you're looking to see what a protochordate was doing, a million, 10 million, 5 million, 100 million years earlier, if they were around that far, what would it look like? Where would you go to find it? How could you even detect it, since there are no Lagerstätten deposits? So the funniest moment I've ever had with Steve Meyer, when he was still here at Whitworth, is he was delivering a public lecture, so I was okay to go, with his class on the Cambrian explosion up at Whitworth. And I was up there in the front, and I asked him a question at the end of it about fossil preservation. And I was very cagey how I phrased it. I said, well, you know, this issue of Precambrian fossil preservation and early Cambrian fossil preservation is really tough to work out. And in this area, I'd like to know how many Tomotian Lagerstätten are there? And you got this deer in the headlight look that just went on and on and on, because he had no idea what I just asked him. And he didn't want to appear ignorant in front of his class by saying, what? So he just stood there. My sister, who was in the back taking notes on this, suddenly noticed there was like silence in the room. And she looked up to see what the hell was going on. You know, did the audio cut off of a live audience? Because there was no microphone. It was just discussion. And finally, after what seemed a really long time, he said, and your point is? It's just the best way that he could wriggle around it. Well, the answer is there are no Tomotian Lagerstätten. There are no Manichaean Lagerstätten. That's the period right before. You are still in the Cambrian. The big explosiony part is occurring a bit down the road. And there's this Manichaean phase where there's, other than Claudina from the Precambrian, and a few tiny other little things that are popping up, that it seems to be almost devoid of life. And then there's the Tomotian phase, when the small shelly fauna appear. These little ice cream cone shaped things about the size of a pin, a writing pen tip. And they just proliferate all over the place. And because they're leaving hard parts, shells, they occur in Russia and all over the place. Then they begin to phase out. And the big Cambrian explosion means that what you had in between the collapse of the Ediacara ecosystem tens of millions of years earlier, you have a series of extinction pulses where you got the bathtub filling up with whatever survived, and they start proliferating, and then there's another gear shift and another, then you get the big Cambrian explosion. There's a lot of mysterious hidden biology going on there that we don't know the details of, because there are no Lagerstätten deposits, none. So we don't know what's inside the shells.
There,
or what's eating them.
Some of the, well, if you look at websites like OneZoom, they put the origin of deuterostomes, and they put, I think, the origin of pretty much everything up to or the common ancestor for pretty much everything up to deuterostomes. I think in the Precambrian, the last deuterostome ancestor being like 560 million years ago, which is just prior to the Cambrian.
Just in the time the Cambrian explosion parts of the Ediacaran ecosystem is collapsing. One of the interesting questions that's just starting to be explored today has to do with those cute little Ediacara. And even today, you find a lot of paleontologists who do not call them fauna. They say Ediacara biota, because they're not sure what the hell they are.
Indian biota.
Are they animals or not? Are some of them more akin to plants? There are no Lagerstätten class deposits for those, so we don't know in incredible detail what their innards are like. But from what can be observed, their way of constructing things is so unlike everything that we're used to from metazoans that they're puzzling. And there's a debate about, can they have homeobox genes or not? Can you generate an Ediacara frond from purely homeobox gene cis-regulatory mutations? And so there's a small number of paleontologists that are trying to figure out how to do that or not. And
I have a question.
Yeah.
There's someone in our comments just said that the concept of subspecies makes them angry. Naming variations within species is pointless. I'd like to answer that by saying, no, it's not.
No, it's not. Definitely not. In fact, it's even more complicated than subspecies. That would be what would basically be called a race back in Darwin's day. And needless to say, creationists just go ballistic over the subtitle of Origins of Species. But the terms that pop up today in population genetics are demes and avatars. And one of them involves population distribution, and other involves genetic distribution. And I go into a little bit of that, I think, in, yipes, I think it's chapter 4 of the old tip thing on creationism light, where I went into Niles Eldridge, who went into a lot of the issues on demes and avatars. But you can see that it becomes very complex in vertebrates because you've not only got your nuclear DNA exchange issues, but mitochondrial DNA. And a fellow, I think his name is Sunderland or whatever, he's a wonderful taxonomy systematics guy, and he delivered a fabulous lecture here at EWU a couple years ago on our Darwin Day, when I hadn't really known about his work, and wow, it was like a gold mine, because he's written a huge number of systematic papers, and his specialty are squirrels. And initially I thought, wow, speciation and hybridization zones in squirrels, this is going to be really dull. It turned out to be anything but dull, because when you look at the actual genetic data, you can see how literally you can identify how the hybridization zones in the speciation processes are occurring in this dance that occurs as the flow of the mitochondrial DNA is interacting with as an isolation mechanism compared to what's going on with the nuclear DNA, and how those work out over time is an indication of how the speciation is going to fix and format over geographical ranges. So you're seeing the nuts and bolts of the speciation process. So that in-species variation stuff, that's the process of how you get zygotic isolation mechanisms and allopatric versus sympatric speciation modes and all of that. Mm-hmm. Am I summing it up reasonably in terms of your understanding, Jackson?
Yeah, I would agree.
And that you find that out when you start reading the primary source literature. And theoretically, if creationism were true, you'd have to ask a simple question. What the hell was keeping them from working out their kindology years before Marsh, even as systematics was being done in the regular evolutionary community for decades? Or why did it take 50 years between Marsh and the little young Turks with Baraminology to come up with the thing where they, for the first time, they go, hey, let's look at this issue, shall we? Or how come with 20 years of effort behind them, it's just still a mess? I can give a hypothetical answer. It's because they're never going to make it fit the data, because the data, for one thing, is constantly expanding faster than they can get at. And no matter how they shuffle the deck chairs on the Titanic, the Baraminology ship is still going to sink, because it's slamming into an iceberg of the fact that it isn't true.
Yeah. I have been listening to what you're saying, but I've also been watching the comment section. There's a guy, the guy who said the subspecies thing is pointless. Can I address him?
Oh, absolutely. Jump right in. Yes, I wish I could have seen that, because I'm not seeing that side feed along there. And so I'm depending on you to act as an interlocutor on that, and fire away, Jackson.
Okay. This guy is saying that the concept of subspecies isn't important because there's too much gray. You are a taxonomist. All right, that's cool. So you say. That's really neat. So, well, in that case, you should know the importance of subspecies. Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a lot of gray area. I mean, there's a lot of gray area among species. That's why you have to look at the genetics and the ecology and the behavior and morphology of organisms to classify them as species. It's not as simple as just looking at the colors of two different organisms and deciding, oh, hey, they're two different species. With subspecies, it's the same. Neanderthals, for instance, are a subspecies of Homo sapiens, just like we are. So was Homo sapiens adultu, the Denisovans, and there's even a new subspecies of humans that has yet to be described that interbred with is it the Melanesians, I think?
Yeah, Nice. And all the same thing of where there's apparently complex, at least 2 or 3 stages involving in Native American migrations into the New World. That whenever we start looking at the nuts and bolts, the same stuff that you're bumping into in that speciation subspecies issue, you're seeing the tracers of all of that complexity. A species is just a temporary name we give to something. And yes, they're real in a fundamental sense, in the sense that you can kind of lump things together as to breeding populations, but yet they're transitory because they're not going to be the same forever. It'll depend on the circumstances and their natural mutations as to which direction they go on. If someone can toss in a question to the guy, how does he use cladistic in his cladism is in his analyses, and how would you think that would bear on it? That'd be a fun question to ask him.
He says, why not call Neanderthals their own species if they are a monophyletic group? Well, species doesn't I mean, yeah, species necessitates monophyly. That's not what I was going for. But Neanderthals, Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us, as this guy probably knows if he's a taxonomist, interbred with Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. And so we see their DNA in our own, something, or if you're a European descent, it's like between 3 and 5% of our DNA is Neanderthal DNA. And we can also see that they had morphological and genetic and behavioral dissimilarities from us.
If memory serves me, I think most of the modern taxonomy would tend to treat, there was a phase when they were just viewing them as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. But I think nowadays they would tend to regard it as Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens sapiens. But you can still have interbreeding hybridization between animals in genuses. That happens all the time. And and it only requires a little bit. Remember, you're going to have Dean and Avatar range. Neanderthals spread across an entire continent. And the same thing for the Homo sapiens that are interacting. So you've got lots of different internal variation that we're not seeing all the details of because we can't do demographic studies on what was going on in Homo sapiens 80,000 years ago.
Okay, he's also saying interbreeding is not the only species concept, even though I said that includes ecological and behavioral and morphological similarities and dissimilarities, but I don't really care. Okay, we can move on.
Well, Mayer's one, which is the interbreedability issue, is probably one of the most dynamic ones. But the ultimate question is what makes a species has to do with how it's exchanging gene flow and how alleles are being moved across the population. That Darwin's insight, which has always been troubling to people, is the idea that a species could be simultaneously kind of a thing that you could recognize at the same time it's actually just a temporary label that you put on stuff. And so as soon as you start seeing transition over time, it becomes squishier and squishier. It's no coincidence that in every single stage in the jumps from one group to another and leading to human beings, from the Australopithecines through Homo habilis and into Homo erectus and finally into Homo sapiens, with the cousins of the Neanderthals and Homo rudolfensis and Homo heidelbergensis and all these others, that when you look at them chronologically, you're seeing areas where you suddenly get a transition zone in which you have taxonomical murkiness, that you have fistfights as to which genus they belong to. There's still a certain number of taxonomists that are not entirely happy with having Homo habilis as Homo. Are they not just the most advanced of the Australopithecines? And how would you tell? The whole point about Linnaean classification is it's got to be a pigeonhole. It either has to be this or that. And so Absolutely. By definition, it can't really address an almost this or a nearly that. Now, when you look down at the detail levels, when you look and see how hybridization zones work in the squirrels, when you look and see how they do in flies, which have been the most meticulously studied, that you now see a very complex dance that's going on where you can see zygotic isolation mechanisms where the female of one subpopulation will interbreed with the male of another, but not the other way around as the door is starting to shut down. Sometimes it can involve something which is almost genetically identical, but a timing switch has changed the time of day of the breeding. So now they're doing their, hey, baby, let's get it on at a different time of day. And so they're no longer interacting with the population that's still doing it at earlier in the day. Those
Right,
sorts of populations
it's a
can be
temporal
virtually
psychotic barrier.
yeah. So there's a bunch of different levels going on. And probably the hardest thing, certainly for anti-evolutionists to do, but a lot of people who are pro-evolution, is to juggle in their heads at the same time all of these different layers that are going on simultaneously, where you've got gene mutations at the structural protein level and at the cis regulatory level, and sometimes even more rarely at the regulatory homeobox genes body plan level. That's much harder to deal with. Then epigenetic cycling, and that's occurring in an individual organism that's part of a population of organisms where those things are happening simultaneously, and that population is interacting with predators and preys and parasites and all sorts of interconnections going on in there. And then larger level ecological context where climate change is altering how the whole population mix of predator and prey is dynamic. Those are all the things that you have to think about simultaneously. And if your brain is not having steam coming out of the ears at that point, you're not getting the gist of it. It isn't meaning that you can't study all those variables, but there is a terrible tendency on the part of a lot of science writing, particularly at the generic level and the open publication level. There's some that are exceptions to this, like Carl Zimmer, and that he knows the layers of stuff in a way that makes him a very good science writer. But too many of them tend to kind of focus in on, well, it's either this or that. Not, it can be this and this and this and some of that and some of that and some of that all happening at once. And that's hard to explain in a blurb that you're trying to put up with a teaser thing at the New York Times.
Okay, this guy is just kind of going. No, I totally understand. I get that. Okay.
Did he answer on the?
He's kind of going off on a tangent now. I guess he says, "I'm not denying."
What's his screen name, and did he answer on the cladism question?
He said, you are correct. He says, my whole point is about the utility of naming taxonomic units under the species. I'm not denying microevolutionary and population genetic variation. Well, no one said he was, but
yeah. So I might quote Stephen Meyer. And your point is,
but oh, I just want to say I think it's kind of funny the fervor of the paleoanthropologists, from what I've seen. You know, is it this or this? And that seems to be remarked on quite a lot.
This is where you just have to get past human beings. I mean, there are no hissy fits as spectacular as what you can see in a technical discipline. And so you can have people carping back and forth. You even find this in abstract mathematics, where you have little cliques of mathematicians going after people about some provability of some hypothesis or not. And boy, they go after it tooth and tongue. It's as bad as Calvinists going after Lutherans. So the idea that human beings, science is a human institution just as much as politics. And you found this in particular in relation to the fistfights that went on between Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins back in the 1990s over adaptationism. And this dragged in Maynard Smith and all the paleontologists. It was usually a paleontology versus biology bunch. And then you also had the fact that there was politics involved, because you had a tendency towards more conservatism. E.O. Wilson was relatively politically conservative, whereas Gould and company are leftists. And so now you had the politics going on, and this was in the heat of the Vietnam War and the Reagan years. And the idea that this stuff is going to occur in a vacuum, independent of all of the personality foibles and politics of the protagonists, get a grip. Of course, it's going to do that. You can still find examples of that, particularly between Alan Fiducia and the Birds Are Anything But Dinosaurs gang.
Oh yeah, ridiculous at this point.
There you got enclaves. Storrs Olson and the gang at the Smithsonian Institution are part of that. Remember, they're coming from ornithology background, not paleontology. Meanwhile, moved to New York, and you go to the Natural History Museum. There you've got all the gang at the Natural History Museum, Norrell and all the rest, who are paleontologists as a rule. They're coming at it from a different direction. And boy, you get fist fights going back and forth, and it's just tooth and claw. Get used to it, buckaroo. But what happens is in real life is, as Stephen or Kuhn said back in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions days, that eventually the protagonists drop dead and a new generation comes along that they just kind of aren't playing the same games after all, and they can just look at the data. So some of the things that were just heated debates, now you've got the newest stuff, Evo Devo and the new evolutionary synthesis that Massimo Pigliucci and others are pushing, Andreas Wagner and others, that it's usually the case that everybody is right and everybody is wrong, and eventually people are going to be picking the nuggets. That's one of the reasons why I put a posting up a while back where I said, get a grip on how you're defining evolution in the public realm. Forget the goddamned allele distribution frequency in populations. Creationists can agree with that. No, natural, branching, common descent. That's the way I define evolution. And anybody in that new Evo Devo branch of things will agree. Everything is related by natural, branching, common descent. Duh. Right. Now you can start fiddly-bidding as to how much of it is evolvability factors and other things. And that's the still macro issue involved. Was there anything inevitable about intelligence? Was there inevitability about multicellularity? I'm frankly, even though Conway Morris is a religious Christian evolutionist, paleontologist, and I'm an atheist evolutionist, non-paleontologist, I think he has the better of the case on the idea that multicellularity occurs basically inevitably in any self-replicating system. It doesn't exactly jump out fast because bacterial systems have a tight editing system that exchanges genetic information without changing their core dynamic. And it takes billions of years for some happenstances to occur where you start having endosymbiotic cooperation systems kicking in to where then they create a new kind of organism that didn't exist before. And that's one of those mega evolution things that Simpson would be talking about, that's above the macroevolution level. That's above the macroevolution
I think
level,
I've vaguely
even though
heard
it's
of
all
that
the same
before.
process. Oh, jumping! I stepped on you, Jackson. Say that again.
No, I said I believe I've heard of that before, the mega evolution. I'm not.
Yeah, Simpson did that, and I think it's Andreas Wagner in his most recent book tried to revive the idea. Because if you think of microevolution, as a mayor would say, that's everything that's happening within a species level. Mm-hmm. And so all that stuff, you've got point mutations at anywhere in the genome, in any context whatsoever. And if it's serious enough, it drops dead, does not reproduce, self-editing. Thank you very much. Now, macroevolution, in my mind, I see it as a gradation. If you want to look at a lower level macroevolution case, the horse sequence is a perfectly fine one. It's something where you're not changing habitat, you're not jumping into the water like whales, you're not changing major metabolism involved. The metabolism of things are pretty much the same. You're losing a couple toes along the way. We can see the genetics of how that happens in the embryology. You're changing some of the teeth, and now we're starting to know the mechanisms of how teeth evolution occurs in mammals, so we'll be able to work out the point mutations on that eventually. That's a low-level macroevolution. Now move up to whales. That's higher level because there is something where it's adapting to an entirely new environment. It's going from a land animal that occasionally eats shellfish on the beach to an animal that ends up echolocating with flippers and live birth while it stays in the water and it never goes on the land ever again and does all of these new things. That's macroevolution, thank you very much. And we can see an awful lot about how that process came about, and we know now since the 1990s on way more of the fossil data and a lot about the genetics and other things. One of my favorite bits about the whale evolution, though, is the fact that whales, toothless whales, still have tooth enamel genes.
Yeah. And if you look,
now, what idiot designer is going to put tooth enamel genes in a toothless mammal? This is like putting a gas tank on a Tesla. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, then when you get up to one of the higher level areas, and this is one where you start skirting into mega evolution, this was one Simpson and others thought about, would be consciousness. And this is one of the snags. Origins of life and consciousness would both be examples of mega evolution. They're at a higher level of qualia. To go from a prebiotic system that becomes a self-replicating Darwinian replicator is not yet known. And anybody who wants to step into the origins of life issue better recognize that it's a minefield, and you better be up on your science literature. Otherwise, some creationists, not all, but some creationists can just chew you up because you'll be way behind the curve on it. The consciousness level is another matter, because there, up until really the development of MRIs and a lot of the genotyping, which means functionally in the last 20 or 30 years, you couldn't know the data set. Yes, you would be looking at the behavior of human beings and the gross genetic level, but to try to figure out what goes on in the brain that allows us to be self-aware is now just beginning to address. Some of this may be a qualia problem issue. Qualia problem, which is why red looks red and not blurble, which is an inconceivable thing that we don't know because nobody knows what blurble is. That kind of qualia issue is intractable. It's not just scientifically difficult to resolve. It is impossible in principle to tell whether you and I or anybody else are literally seeing the same blue on a Pepsi can. You can measure the wavelengths, you can measure the neuroscience of what's going on, but that qualia, there's no way to get in your head to tell. And consciousness may be part of that problem. Jump in, Jackson.
I wanted to, I had to pause my camera, or not camera, microphone for a moment there. But yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, the whales, the toothless whales, the baleen, they have the genes for teeth. They're also whale fossils, like I think it's Chonocetus, that have part baleen, part teeth.
Yeah, they found transitional fossils in this area. That the paleontology is so exciting, and the whales aren't the easiest bunch to study. I mean, you don't exactly go out, pick a sperm whale up in the ocean, do its DNA, and then say bye-bye. To this day, we don't know very much about how sperm whales feed. They feed so deep in the water that when they try to put little test cameras on the damn thing, the environment screws up the damn camera long before we can ever see just exactly how they're chomping, or are they, on giant squid or some of these other little things. So there are a lot of areas that are just technically difficult to wrangle. Now, for me, the most interesting, ironically, the most interesting question is not how are we conscious, it's how we have grammatical language. That's the really interesting puzzle, because once you have grammatical language, a whole cascade works out of things that occur because of that in terms of indirect reciprocity and morality and a bunch of things. Now, if you want to give the shorthand definition of what makes human beings unique, there's two things. We are the tool-making species that tell stories. That's it. It's both of those together, because we can make tools in a way other animals make tools, primitive tools in some cases, but they can't tell stories. And other animals apparently can tell stories. It's presumably the case that I suspect that humpback whales tell stories to one another in their songs. But we don't know, because we're not a humpback whale and we can't figure out what the hell they're saying. But my suspicion is there's something interesting level going on there, which we can't even conceptualize, because the divergence in evolution over the time with us and the cetaceans is so broad that their neural architecture is so incompatible with what we're used to that their movie in the brain is not at all like ours. And the example I like to give as an analogy, if you remember from the old Next Generation, when Jean-Luc Picard was trapped on a planet with an alien who he discovered that the universal translator wouldn't translate his stuff. And it turned out the guy's language spoke in metaphors. And it took him a while to figure out what the metaphors were, to where then he could start communicating by metaphor with this guy. So the whole internal structure of the language was alien. And that's actually a good implication of what might be strange for trying to figure out cetacean language systems. Remember, cetacean brains are very different from ours. Dolphins never sleep completely. We have our thing where we shut down every night repeatedly, to where the brain doesn't deactivate, but we're turned off. Whereas dolphin brains apparently only shut down half at a time. So they're always functional, but one hemisphere is shut down and then the other one switches off and the other one turns back on. Well, what does it mean if they have hemispheric specialization in their brain? What kind of environment cognitively is it where during their not quite sleep mode, some of the things that are hemispherically specialized aren't functioning? That's a fascinating question that it's not going to be easy to figure out.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I unfortunately have to go now.
Oh, okay. So that, I hope you did not, well, we've been at it for quite a while. You know, we've been at it for an hour and 43 minutes. So that was longer than the other thing. I hope you have not been bored. I hope those following along in the conversation line, even though I couldn't see all of it, have found Jackson an intelligent guy who has things to put in and good questions. And you just have to remember that you can say, shut up, RJ, so that you can get a word in edgewise more often.
Okay. If you'd breathe.
I know, I can breathe and talk at the same time. It drives everybody nuts.
All right. Well, yeah, this is going to be, you know what we should do since it's two of you? We should do a plug and pug like we do on movie nights.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And thank you so much, Jackson. I'm glad that we were able to do this, that we had some glitches earlier on in the day. I hope you can get PZ Myers. Everybody should say your invite to PZ Myers is a legitimate one, and he would benefit and have an intelligent discussion with you if he would take the plunge on that.
Yeah, I hope so. I certainly hope it goes well and that I don't have any technical difficulties with it.
All right. Well, this went fairly well. You know what I wish? I wish we had... I was kind of hoping Rayrard, we could get him into the hangout to make, because, you know, in the chat, he can't really make his point. I think that would have made it more clear between what he was trying to say, and you guys would probably have had a more productive conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to see more examples of where we got people on the screen like this. We're doing essentially what we do in the movie night, because that you can get some interactions that way that I think are more vivid than trying to do the side screen. And then, of course, I would also want to have a thing where I can see the damn chat window up as a separate thing, where I don't have to wonder whether or not the face is going to blot it out or not.
All right. Very good. All right. Well, we'll let us close it the way we do our movie nights with plug and pug once again. Jackson is for Jackson. If you don't mind, tell us how cool you are and what you do and your YouTube channel, whatever. Just tell us all that if you don't mind.
Well, my channel is Jackson Wheat, and I try to make science videos. I'm also on Twitter, so check me out. I guess if
follow the guy on Twitter.
To Ray, if you want to continue this conversation and convince me that subspecies are pointless, then you might be right. And if you have good evidence for it, then I'll believe you. So there you go.
Nice.
I'm open to changing my mind.
Indeed. Yeah, it's just between chat and sometimes there's some... It's harder to communicate that way. I'm sure had we all been talking in the hangout, it would have gone much. All right, well, let's see. Who else do we have? RJ.
Yeah, AJ, oh, damn commercial time. That's because some of us are desperate financially and therefore have to do these sorts of things because we're not loaded with money to live.
All right. Was that your whole plug?
That's in a nutshell.
All right. Everybody take care of RJ. He gives us a lot of information for free. Let's help him out, shall we? All right.
Just remember, do you want to have a world in which more people support Jeranism than my Patreon? Is that right?
That is kind of freaky, isn't it? All right. Well, if there's nothing else, guys, I guess we say goodnight. And thank you both for that conversation you had.
It was a fun conversation.
All right.
Even though I did, as usual, talk.
All right. Well, all right, all. Here comes the pug.
I like the Wheat Watchers up there. That's clever, Paranorm.
All right. Here we go. Nice talk, guys.
I had a good time with you guys.
They should drop by for some movie nights. We're very abusive.
Wait, what?
So you should drop by for our movie nights. We're very abusive.
Oh, okay. I'll have to do that sometime. But I've got to head out.
Okay. Good night. Have a good evening.
Au revoir. Auf
All right,
Wiedersehen,
thank you very much
aloha.
for having me. Good night.
RJ, you know, I was just looking for an excuse to play the fun song again.
I just like the pug. That's a cute pug.
I probably should have trimmed the song down to not make everybody wait this long for.
No, I think it was a broad-ranging thing. Of course, anybody who detests Dinesh music can be all bad. And then baraminology, that's a core problem with anti-evolutionism. That unpacks the range of dumb when you start to how they do or do not deal with stuff.
Yeah, and how you can tack an ology onto the end of something that's basically meaningless just amuses the hell out of me.
But it isn't really basically meaningless. They're really being sciencey. It's pathetic, but it's still sciencey. Because they're trying to apply the logic of their own position. And they're trying to be rigorous and consistent about it. The problem is that they can never really be truly consistent or rigorous because they've got to eliminate most of the data and they always have to arrive at a preconceived conclusion. And that's not what works well in the sciences. So there's a schizoidal quality about baraminology that is fascinating to watch methodologically. It's a slow-mo train wreck.
Indeed. All right, well, this about wraps it up. Good night, all.